And we're going to continue with the 8th chapter of The House with a Clock in Its Walls. Um, Lewis is not having a good time. He feels like he's keeping secrets from his uncle and Mrs. Zimmerman. Plus, he keeps running into Hammerhandle on the street, bringing stuff to the house across the street, which he has weird feelings about. Hedges have grown in front to cover the windows, and trees to cover other windows. So now Lewis is home by himself, and we'll pick up from there. Lewis wandered down the drafty hall, opening and closing doors. None of the rooms seemed worth exploring today, but wait, sure! The room with the parlor organ. He could go play it. It would be fun. One of the disused parlors on the third floor had a dusty old parlor organ in it. It was one of the few pieces of furniture that was left from the time Isaac Izzard had lived in the house. Of course there was a parlor organ downstairs, a good one, but it was a player organ and often refused to let Lewis play what he wanted to play. The one up here was wheezy, and in the winter its voice was only a whisper, but you could sometimes get good tunes out of it if you pumped hard. Lewis opened the door. The parlor organ was a bulky shadow against one wall. Lewis found the light switch, and the light came on. He wiped some dust off the seat and sat down. What would he play? Chopsticks, probably, or From a Wigwam. His repertoire wasn't very large. Lewis pumped the warm treadles, and he heard a hissing and puffing that came from deep inside the machine. He touched the keys, but all he got was a gaspy, tubercular sound. Darn. He sat back and thought. Over the keys was a row of black organ stops with labels that said things like Vox Humana, Solicet, and Flute. Lewis knew that these stops were supposed to change the sound of the organ in various ways, but he had never pulled any of them out. Well, now was the time. He grabbed one of the black tubes and tugged gently. It wouldn't budge. He wiggled the stop and pulled harder. The whole thing came out in his hand. Lewis sat there, staring stupidly at the piece of wood. At first, he felt bad about breaking the organ, but then he looked more closely at the stop. The end that had been in the organ was blunt, smooth, and painted black. There was no sign that it had ever been hooked up to anything. What a cheesy outfit, Lewis thought. I wonder if they're all like that. Let's see. He pulled in another. Pop! He pulled them all out. Pop, 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 pop. Lewis laughed. He rolled the black tubes back and forth over the keyboard, but then he stopped and thought. He had read a story once where a car had a dummy dashboard that came out so you could hide things behind it. What if this organ? He got up and went downstairs. He went all the way down to the cellarway, where Jonathan kept his tools. He opened the toolbox and took out a screwdriver, a hammer, and a rusty butter knife that Jonathan kept there for prying things open. Then he went back upstairs as fast as he could. Now Lewis was sitting at the organ again. He scanned the long wooden panel. 7 round black holes stared back at him. There were 4 screws holding the panel of the organ case, and they came out easily. Lewis stuck his fingers into 2 of the holes and pulled. The panel was stuck. He thought a bit. Then he picked up the butter knife and slid it into a crack. Scrack! A little eddy of dust rose and tickled his nostrils. He moved the knife along to the right a bit and pried again. Scrack! The panel flopped out onto the keyboard. Ah! Now we would see what was what. Lewis bent over and put his head close to the hole. He could smell a lot of dust, but he couldn't see a thing in there. Darn it, he had forgotten to bring a flashlight. He reached in and felt around. His arm went in all the way up to the armpit. He groped some more. What was this? Paper? He heard a dry crackling sound. Maybe it was money. He grabbed hold of the bundle and drew it out. His heart sank. It was just an old pile of papers. Lewis sat there staring at them in disgust. So this was the secret treasure of Izzard's castle. Some treasure. Well, there might be something interesting in them, like secret formulas. He flipped through the papers. He flipped some more. The light in the room was very weak, and the old paper had turned practically the same shade as the copper-colored ink Isaac Izzard had used. He figured the writing must be Isaac Izzard, since the first sheet said, Cloud formations and other phenomena observed from this window by Isaac Izzard. Hadn't Mrs. Zimmerman said she had seen old Isaac taking notes on the sky? There were dates here and entries after that. Lewis read a few entries, and his eyes opened wider. He leafed some more. A spatter of rain hit the window. Lewis jumped. Outside he could see thick masses of blue clouds piled up in the west. Through them ran a jagged red streak. It looked to Louis like a hungry mouth. As he watched, the mouth opened and a ray of blood-red light shot into the room. It lit up the page he was holding. On the page were scrawled these words: "Doomsday not yet come. I'll draw it nearer by a perspective, or make a clock that shall set all the world on fire upon an instant." Louis felt very frightened. He gathered the papers together and started to get up. As he did so, he heard a noise, a very faint noise. Something was fluttering around down inside the organ case. Louis stumbled backward, knocking over the bench. The papers slid out of his hand and scattered over the floor. What should he do? Run for his life or save the papers? He gritted his teeth and knelt down. As he gathered up the sheets, he said to himself over and over again, "Quota tuus Deus fortitudo mea. Quota tuus Deus fortitudo mea." Now he had all the papers again. He was about to dash for the door when he saw something come floating up out of the darkness inside the organ. A moth with silver-gray wings. They shone like leaves in the moonlight. Louis ran to the door. He rattled the knob, but he couldn't get it open. Now he could feel the moth in his hair. Louis went rigid. His face flushed. He was not scared any more. He was angry, very angry. He swatted at the moth and crushed it. Louis felt a horrible runny stickiness in his hair, and all the fear came rushing back. He wiped his hand frantically on his trouser leg. Now Louis was out in the hall, running and shouting, "Uncle Jonathan! Mrs. Zimmerman, come quick! Oh, please, come quick! I've found something! Uncle Jonathan!" A little while later, Jonathan, Louis, and Mrs. Zimmerman were sitting around Mrs. Zimmerman's kitchen table, drinking cocoa. The dusty papers lay in a heap on the table. Jonathan put down his mug and said, "No, Louis, I tell you again, there's nothing to worry about. Old Isaac was crazy as a coot. This stuff has nothing to do with the ticking noise in the walls, or if it does, it can't help us any. It can only frighten us." "I'd say that was why Isaac left those papers there, wouldn't you, Jonathan? To frighten us to death, I mean." Oh, this was Mrs. Zimmerman, so let's do it in her voice. "I'd say that's why Isaac left those papers there, wouldn't you, Jonathan? To frighten us to death, I mean." This was Mrs. Zimmerman speaking. She was standing at the stove with her back to Louis, and she was making a great show of stirring the cocoa. Sure I'd say that was it, Florence," said Jonathan, nodding. "One last trick for the road, and that sort of thing." Louis looked from one to the other. He knew they were covering up, but what could he say? One thing would lead to another, and before long he would have to tell about Halloween night. When you are hiding something, you get the feeling that every other secret is connected to your secret. Louis couldn't challenge anyone for fear of being exposed himself. Late that same night, Louis lay awake in his bed, listening to Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman talking. They were in the study below, and as usual their voices drifted up the hot air register, and as usual he couldn't quite make out what they were saying. He got out of bed and crawled over to the wooden grating in the floor. A warm breath of heat softly beat at his face. He listened. Even now he couldn't hear well enough. There was only one thing to do. He had to use the secret passageway. Louis put on his bathrobe and tiptoed down the back stairs. The kitchen was dark. Good. Slowly, carefully, he removed all the china from the shelves of the china cupboard. Then he tripped the hidden spring of the cupboard, and the cupboard swung outward. He walked softly in. This time, Louis remembered to bring a flashlight. Not that he needed it much. He didn't have far to go, and light shone through many chinks into the cobwebbed passage. Before long, he was standing behind the bookcases that lined the wall of Jonathan's study. He peered through a crack in the boards, and there, beyond the books, were Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman. Mrs. Zimmerman had just conjured up a match out of thin air, and she was lighting a long, twisted cigar with it. She blew smoke out of both corners of her mouth. "Well, now we know," she said. "Yes, now we know." Jonathan's voice came from his leather armchair where he sat slumped. All that Louis could see of him was one blue-sleeved arm, and a set of hairy knuckles grasping the chair arm. "The question is," Jonathan went on, "can we do anything about it?" Mrs. Zimmerman began to pace. Cigar smoke trailed off behind her. She scraped the large purple stone of her ring along the whole length of a bookshelf. "Do?" she said. Do we fight them? What else? Jonathan gave a hoarse laugh. It made Louis feel very uncomfortable. Easier said than done, Florence. They're both stronger than we are, you know. We only fiddle around with magic. They gave their lives to it. As for her, she may have quite literally given her life for it. But why would they want to do what they're doing? Said Mrs. Zimmerman, folding her arms and puffing angrily at her cigar. Why? This beautiful world, end it. Why? Jonathan thought a minute. Well, Florence, I can't really see into the workings of a mind like Isaac Izzard's, but I'd say the answer was scientific curiosity. Think of all that's been written about the last day, graves opening, bodies rising up fresh and new. Some think there will be a whole new earth, much better than the present one. Wouldn't you like to see it? And another thing occurs to me. Isaac and Selena Izzard didn't enjoy this world very much. Why shouldn't they try for the next one? Jonathan puffed on his hookah. There was silence for several minutes. And the clock, said Mrs. Zimmerman. I have to hand it to you. You were dead right. There is a real, literal clock in these walls. He calls it a device, but it has to be a clock. He wasn't kind enough to tell us where it is, of course, though it seems to me that he tells practically everything else. He even gives hints about where he hid the key. Not that matters now. She broke her cigar in two and threw it into the fireplace. But there's one thing I'd like to know, she said, turning suddenly to Jonathan. Why did he need a clock to bring about the end of the world? Louis gasped and put his hand to his mouth. Then it was going to be the end of the world after all. Because he lost the moment, Jonathan answered. The moment he had been seeking all those years. It was quite a search that old Isaac made. That's why he has all those crazy notes about the mackerel skies and last judgment skies and clouds that look like chariots and trumpets and masks of doom. That was what he was after, a mask of doom, a sky that would be right for his incantations. Sky magic is old stuff, you know. The Romans used to. Yes, cut in Mrs. Zimmerman impatiently. I know all about sky and bird divination. Who's got the D-Mag-A around here, anyway? All right. So the right sky comes along for old Droopy Drawers. Fine, dandy. So why doesn't he just wave his wand and turn us all into mullygrubs? Because by the time he had made sure it was the right kind of sky, the sky had changed. It doesn't take long for clouds to move and change their patterns, you know. Or maybe he lacked the heart to do it. It sounds silly, but I keep hoping that was what held him off. Him? Lack of heart? Isaac Izzard? He was a hard man, Jonathan. He'd have pulled out his mother's teeth one by one if he had to have them for some devil magic. Jonathan sighed. Maybe you're right. I don't know. The important thing is that he did miss his opportunity. That's why he had to build the clock, to bring the time back. The exact time when everything was right and in its place. That's what he means when he talks about a device to redeem the time. Redeem, indeed. He wanted to destroy us all. Mrs. Zimmerman was pacing again. All right, she said, all right, so he built the clock. Why didn't he just wind it up? He couldn't. Not all the way, at any rate. Didn't you read that passage? Jonathan got up and went to the library table, where the papers were lying. He picked them up and leafed until he found the page he wanted. Ah, here it is. But when the device was completed, I found that I lacked the skill to wind it all the way up. I tried hard, but I must conclude that one with greater powers than I possess will be needed for this final adjustment. Curse the day she left me. Curse the day she went away. She might have done it. Jonathan looked up. In the last sentence, the word she is underlined 4 times. She, of course, is our friend across the street. Louis closed his eyes. Mrs. O'Meager really was Mrs. Izzard, then. He had guessed it, of course, but he hadn't been sure. Mrs. Izzard, and he had let her out. He felt like the stupidest, most foolish person in the whole world. And there we will pause.